The encomienda system was particularly brutal, uh, especially to the uh, existent inhabitants of the area, the natives. So the scale of death, this rapid depopulation, began to concern some Spanish people by the early to mid 16th century. Someone who became concerned about the scale of death among the natives was a former governor of a Caribbean island named Bartolome de las Casas. He returned to Spain and became a priest. And late in his life, a few years before he died, he wrote a book called Destruction of the Indies. And this book is kind of how we know a lot about the activities of Spain in their colonies in the early years. Las Casas wrote about how natives were treated by Spaniards on his island and how quickly they died and how much the natives were brutalized and abused. And this book was very popular reading all throughout Europe, also in Spain. So late in his life, he took it upon himself to advocate for the Native Americans, kind of ironically because he had been involved in their exploitation earlier in his life. But he changed his ways after he became a priest and as he got older and believed that someone needed to advocate for them in Spain, which he did. The book was highly popular reading throughout Europe, and a lot of the other European countries used it to criticize Spain. Uh, the Spanish did try to introduce some reforms as a result of the book in order to kind of minimize the native deaths, but by the time these reforms went through in the 1550s, it was too little too late. So the Spanish government did try to say to the encomenderos, there must be a limit on how much you can force your subjects to work. There has to be some kind of a maximum hour limit of work. Also, a limit to what kind of work you can force people to do at what times of the year. But for the most part, those efforts really didn't have much effect because the damage had already been done. But what we know about the encomienda system comes quite a bit from Las Casas's book Destruction of the Indies. So during this entire time, Europe started to jump ahead or engage in kind of a quantum leap in technological sophistication. One major reason was because of all the riches that came back from the New World, all this gold coming back. A lot of the encomenderos planted sugar plantations. So sugar was a major cash crop that enriched Europe considerably in the early years, particularly Spain and Portugal. But by far the most successful commodity of the New World was silver. The uh, the Spanish made a lot of money off of silver and gold mining, but particularly silver. They pretty much stripped the area clean of gold. But silver they continued to bring in high quantities back from the New World, which made Spain very wealthy. So by 1600, Spain went from being a backwater of a backwater to one of the richest kingdoms in the world. So Spain was kind of a somewhat backward part of Europe prior to 1492, and Europe was the backward part of the world. So in 100 years, Spain went from being that backwater of a backwater to being essentially the third richest kingdom in the world, third to China and the Ottoman Empire. So Spain was extraordinarily wealthy. You can see this image indicates where the major settlements were and the major mining and uh, agricultural operations producing sugar. The Spanish did occasionally think about the other part of their mission, which was converting people to Christianity. So they did set up a series of missions in their northern frontier. In part, this was to maintain a stronger hold in this North American region, and also the effort was led by the Franciscan monks to convert natives to Christianity. So these series of mission systems was built in the 18th century, in the 1700s. They didn't work all that well. They didn't get that many converts, and they ended up being just kind of military outposts in the end. Spain, they became controversial in Spain because Spain could no longer afford them by the 18th century. It was a very expensive operation. But in any case, you had the Franciscan monks who were inspired by Saint Francis, who uh, lived a life of poverty and obedience, copying the example of Jesus. These people also lived a very regulated existence. You had to pray so many times a day. That was something the natives didn't take to very well, were all the restrictions on their lifestyle that the monks, the missionaries wanted them to engage. So the first Spanish outpost and first European outpost to last a significant amount of time was the settlement at New Mexico that the Spanish planted around what's now Santa Fe. So the Spanish sent a number of expeditions up to the northern part of their colonies, but most of those didn't work out. They never found the gold they were looking for out there. But in the early part of the 17th century, around 1610, a conquistador named Juan de Oñate did succeed in planting a settlement and establishing a permanent colony, which he called New Mexico, nearby, or what's now Santa Fe, New Mexico. So the Spanish established a small colony there. It grew to somewhat over 1,500 Spanish colonists by the late 17th century. So it was a small outpost, but it was surviving and producing a few goods. For the most part, though, it wasn't very economically successful, especially not compared to the rest of Spanish colonies, particularly central Mexico. The Spanish had some problems in New Mexico, though. So over the ensuing years between 1610 and 1680, the Spanish demanded a lot of tribute and goods from the Pueblo Indians that lived in the area. They had also tried to convert a lot of Pueblo Indians to Christianity, and disease had ravaged the Pueblo Indians. So the Pueblo Indians declined from having 100 villages in 1610 to down to about 30 villages in the region of northern New Mexico by 1680. So the Pueblo were under great stress due to the Spanish, and the Spanish kept demanding that the Pueblo give them whatever goods they had, whatever crops they had, whatever blankets they made, whatever baskets and pottery they made. The Spanish demanded a lot of that. And when the Pueblo could not provide the trade goods that the Spanish wanted, the Spanish would raid outlying Indian settlements that belonged to other Indians, such as the Utes that lived up in Utah, or the Cheyenne that lived in Colorado. So the Pueblo eventually got tired of that, and there began a religious movement among the remaining Pueblo in their villages that centered on kicking the Spanish out. And one of those religious leaders was a man named Pope. We don't know much else about him, but we know he was one of these religious movement leaders that called on Pueblo to reject Christianity and reject the European conventions and go back to their native ways. So the Spanish got wind of this, and they captured a number of these religious leaders, including Pope, in the late 1670s, and arrested them and tortured them, essentially. We know Pope was one of these people who suffered torture at the hands of the Spanish authorities because he was one of these uh, potential rebels. And after he was released from captivity, we don't know what exactly happened, but apparently he organized his rebellion more effectively after that, and about a year later in 1680, he led a large-scale revolt against the Spanish in Santa Fe. So the Pueblo revolt was highly successful and pushed out the Spanish. It was so bad that the Spanish governor himself in Santa Fe was injured and had to retreat back into Mexico. It had to retreat down to what's now Ciudad Juarez area, south of Texas. So the Pueblo revolt was the most successful Native American revolt in all of history, actually forcing out European colonizers from a region, and succeeded in keeping the Spanish out for a number of years. The Spanish did return, but it took time. So the Pueblo revolt accomplished much more than any other Native American revolts, even those Native American revolts that killed more people, because those revolts did not succeed in actually forcing a retreat of European colonizers, while the Pueblo revolt did. All right, so that's it for the presentation on Spain and the Americas. So thanks for bearing with me on that, and stay tuned for the next unit, which will involve England's explorations.